Talent is not related to your IQ. People often think, well, if you're a mega genius, you're going to get ahead in the world, and if you have a low IQ, you're not. If you have a look at Forbes magazine's correlation between earnings and IQ, there is no link whatsoever. Yeah. You can be as dumb as a bowl of yogurt and become very, very rich. So that's the good news. In fact, what tends to happen is almost the opposite. People who are super genius tend to get lost in the world of academics and are not actually as practical when it comes to building their careers and making money. So, the wisdom these days says you need a functional IQ. You need to be able to function with the world around you, and in terms of developing talent, that's it, that's good enough. That's all you need. Talent isn't detectable early. You know the last time your 2-year-old started building blocks, you said he's going to be an architect. Or your 1.5-year-old picked up a doll and started nursing it better and you went, doctor for her. Unfortunately, the reality of the thing is that talent is more determined by what you're telling the child they're going to be than by them picking up the blocks or the dolls and playing with it. Talent is not detectable early, but it can be created early in children. And that's the interesting part. Talent is also not limited. We have yet to find limits to talent. And they've been pushing the bounds in terms of testing this. One simple example. They have been working with people who are able to memorize long strings of numbers. And at first it was thought again that this was either a genetic thing or you were born into a family that was simply able to do that. The latest research shows that you can take anyone, and with the right training and coaching, you can teach them to memorize long strings of numbers. There are ways of coaching and teaching that kind of talent. They've been trying to find limits to it. How many numbers can you teach a person to memorize, for example? What tends to happen is that the test subjects get annoyed with the process before they find their talent cap. I think the record at this point in time is something like 450 consecutive numbers remembered off the top of the head. But the person eventually got so annoyed with the stress of going through these tests that they gave up. But they hadn't found a cap yet. We don't know where talent ends. And that's good news for all of us. Mozart. We often talk about this child prodigy. And in fact, there's been a recent story within the last sort of, let's say, 20 years and part of our lifetime that very much reflects Mozart's lifestyle. And it's in the world of sports. Can you think of the child prodigy who went to the top of the world in the world of sports? Took a bit of a tumble recently, but he's back. Tiger Woods, yes. Tiger Woods' life story and Mozart's life story are almost exactly the same. And they bear out the talent formula. They prove how it works. Let's start with Mozart. Most people see Mozart as this child prodigy who was just born amazing. And there are two versions of Mozart's life story. Both are accurate, but one gives us a little bit more of the picture. Let me tell you the first version. The first version is the one that most people have heard. Young Mozart was 5 years old when he started composing his own original classical music. When he was 6 and 7, he was playing for heads of states, kings and queens across Europe. In his teens, he wrote his first full-scale opera. Anyone here write an opera in their teens? Anyone here write a book in their teens? Anyone here write anything longer than an essay in their teens? That's impressive. Then, the next one, of course, is that he passed away at the age of 35, having been considered, and he's still considered, one of the greatest musical legends of all time. Young Mozart, 35 years old when he died, and famously buried in a pauper's grave in a sack with other bodies around him. Now that's one version of the story. Here's the other version of the story, which is equally true. Long before young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born, his father, Leopold Mozart, was also a relatively famous musician and composer. Did anyone know that? Ah, that's interesting. When Mozart was about to be born, his father quit his own musical career and took up teaching music to children. Do you think that might have helped? By the age of 2, young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was being exposed to an extensive musical training program. And I don't mean, like most parents do, they let him listen to music, I mean he was training him for a set number of hours every single day from the age of 2. Now, it's also correct to say that when he was 5 years old, he was writing his own original classical music, but it's not the whole truth. You see, what he was actually doing is he was taking music from other famous composers and rearranging it in his own original ways. Okay, not bad, but it's not quite what we're told. Also, he didn't write the music down. His dad did. Oh well, that's fine. It's also true that when he was in his teens, young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart wrote his first full-scale opera. Absolutely true. Here's the part people don't tell you. It was rubbish. If you tune in to Classic FM, you're never going to hear it, because it wasn't good music. It's only the fact that he wrote an opera, but it wasn't considered a great opera or even particularly good. The first truly great music that Mozart ever wrote completely on his own was at the age of 21, after only 2 decades of intensive coaching and training. Mozart was an overnight success. It only took 20 years. Interesting. Tiger Woods' story, absolutely exactly the same. 2 years of age, there he is in his little crib and he's watching his dad hit golf balls. And man, if you're a little 2-year-old boy, Dad is the hero. You want to be like Dad. So at the age of 2.5, 3, his dad starts coaching him in golf. And intensively coaching him, hours, regimented hours, and practice every single day. By the age of 20, Tiger Woods, once again, was an overnight success. 2 decades of practice and intense coaching. Talent is not what we are led to believe. But the cool part is, that means it's accessible to everyone else. We have the option of being a Tiger Woods. We don't necessarily need to live like him and get into the tabloids, but we have the option. So the next one, of course, is the gifted family. You've all been to the family function. Maybe it's the Christmas party, maybe it's the birthday party, whatever the case might be, where there's that one side of the family who all get together and sing. And they're usually all wearing matching jerseys, all the same color. And they are all these amazing songbirds, and it's just this wonderful, beautiful thing, and you think to yourself, but talent must be genetic because they're all good at it. The reality is, they are all part of a tribe that trains in it. That's how talent actually works. Now, there are a lot of stereotypes like that around tribes that are good at things. Folks, let's take a moment to be politically incorrect. Can you think of any? I'll give you one. Jewish people are good at business. What are some of the others? What are the stereotypes around tribes of people who are good at things? Indians are good at sales. Okay? Jewish people are good at business. In America, it's the black guys are good at basketball and white men can't jump. Absolutely. And if you look at it, there are places all around the world where these kinds of stereotypes hold up, and we go, well, then it must be genetic. The answer is actually the opposite. They are part of families, they are part of communities, they are part of tribes that value and train those things. That's how the myth of the gifted family comes about. They're part of a group of people who take that seriously. Very, very interesting stuff. So, what is talent? Here's the crux and the heart and soul of this presentation. This information is useful to you, but it implies a lot of hard work. Would you like to know what talent is?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Talent equals yearning plus input plus deliberate practice sustained. That's what talent is. Yearning plus input plus deliberate practice sustained. Each of those words implies a great deal of things. Let's start off with yearning. Imagine if I didn't like skateboarding as a kid. Imagine if I saw skateboarding as the same thing as maths homework. My parents wanted me to be a skateboarder, but I couldn't be less interested. After I fell down that set of stairs and took the skin off my back, do you think I'd ever do it again? Now imagine, you've probably had kids who tried skateboarding. Think of the number of times that they bashed their shins, hurt their knees. If they didn't love it, if they didn't yearn for it, they would never get past injury number 1. But if you do yearn for it, if you do love what you do, you'll break your body in half in the pursuit of it. Now that's an interesting one in terms of our careers and our performance. If we love what we do, we can go incredibly far. If we do not love what we do, it's like closing a door on our talent development. Now, you don't necessarily have to love the difficult part of what you do, by which I mean, I didn't love falling down a staircase. That was awful. However, there must be some reward in it for you, some reason that you get up and do it and love it. And if there is that element, that love of the thing, that yearning, then we can go on to the next step in the development of talent. And that is input. You can have all the love in the world for what you do, but if you get no input, you can't grow. Your yearning will only take you so far. Input is absolutely anything. It's books on the topic. It's lectures on the topic. But the best one is personal coaching. Personal coaching. That's why, particularly in the corporate world, coaching has become such a big deal. They've discovered that in terms of how you develop your talent, the number one way to get a human being to perform is to have one other person side by side with them, showing them how. That's the most effective way. Now, in the absence of that, there's still reading books, watching documentaries, seeking out the information for yourself. But the most effective way is to have a coach who actually shows you how. That's why Tiger Woods was so good. That's why Mozart was so good. They yearned for it. They wanted to be that, and they had a coach showing them how every single day. The thing about a coach particularly is that they can see your blind spots. You know that phrase in psychology that goes, you don't know what you don't know? That's what coaches are for. They can see the things in our performance that we don't see. I still try to work with coaches for public speaking. If I have a big speech coming up, or if I have a contest coming up, I like to show my speech to someone else and get their input. Because I'm so close to my work that I can't see what the faults are. And without that outside input, I can't grow and get to the next level. So that input is a very, very big deal. That's number 2. So we take our yearning and then we add input. After that, we need deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is a fascinating one because it's not the same thing as what we think of when we think practice. Question: do you think it's possible for a person to play golf for 10 years and not get any better? I think so. I think some people would say it's quite possible to get slightly worse over the years. Here's why. Most people who think that they practice golf only play a game of golf. Deliberate practice is something very different. Here's the difference between Tiger Woods and a guy who just plays golf. The guy who plays golf goes to the golf course with his mates, he knocks a couple of balls around, gets to the last hole, goes for drinks and goes home. And he thinks he's practiced golf. Tiger Woods gets there first thing in the morning and he wants to work on how to get a ball out of a sand trap. So he takes his ball, he puts it in the sand trap and he knocks it out. Then he gets his ball, he puts it back in the sand trap and he knocks it out. And he does it over and over and over for hours. Preferably with a coach watching him and telling him what he's doing wrong and helping him to grow. That's deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is breaking a thing down into its smallest parts and then building them back up again on purpose. Just an interesting thought. That's why most people fear public speaking. The only time they ever practice is doing a presentation live in front of others. And that's not the same thing as practice. In fact, that's quite traumatizing. You never get to practice behind the scenes. The only time you ever try it is live in front of a group of people, you feel it goes badly and you go home thinking, oh, that was awful, I never want to do it again. Deliberate practice in public speaking looks like this. You get into a room with maybe a mirror. You close all the doors so that you have privacy. Maybe you have a coach in the room with you. You stand in front of the mirror and you work on one thing, like how to do gestures with your hands, or how to use your facial expressions to make your ideas come alive, or how to stand, or how to move about correctly, or how to use your voice. Then you start putting all of those things together and you become a great speaker because of the deliberate practice. But if you just stand up in front of an audience and present, chances are you'll never get any better at it. It's not the same thing as deliberate practice. So the difficult question for you becomes, what are the small elements of what you do that you can get better at in isolation, one little bit at a time? I did promise this was a lot of hard work. The final part is sustained over time. In other words, we have to keep doing it over and over for a set amount of time. The question then, of course, is, in fact, I'll jump over to that now, how much time? How much time do you think it takes to become truly great at something? There's a popular figure that's talked about quite often these days, and it is in fact correct. How many hours to become great at something? Anyone know?
I don't know.
I see people jumping onto Google really quickly. The answer is 10,000 hours. Or, roughly, 10 years. That's how much deliberate practice it takes to become masterclass at something. Yeah. We'll chat about that 10,000 hours concept again in just a moment's time. Does anyone read Stephen King's books? The guy who did for clowns what Spielberg did for sharks. Stephen King has an interesting accolade. He writes horror novels, as you probably know. Now, he has written over 50 books, and he doesn't know what it feels like to write a book and not have it go to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. That has never happened to him. Every single book he writes goes right to the top. In my book on how to be an expert in your industry, I quote him at the beginning of the book. Stephen King says, "Talent is as cheap as table salt." What separates the talented individual from the truly successful one is honest, hard work. How disappointing is that? Don't we wish there was some kind of a magic bullet? But that's what he says, and he is the best-selling living author today, in spite of things like Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling, and in spite of 50 Shades of Grey. I got to tell you, one of my books I just mentioned there is called 50 Ways to Position Yourself as an Expert, and I wrote that before 50 Shades of Grey came out. But now that 50 Shades of Grey is this worldwide phenomenon, I have a book called 50 Ways, and it has positioning in the title. So it sounds a little dodgy. It's actually quite innocent. Stephen King says, this is the difference between me and an amateur writer who aspires to become great. Monday morning, I wake up, sit down, and I write 1,000 words. On the other side of the world, this amateur writer gets up, sits down, and also writes 1,000 words. And at this point, we are on a par. But here's the difference. After lunch, he says, I come back, sit down, and write another 1,000 words. The aspiring writer comes back after lunch, looks at what he's written and goes, that was pretty good, and takes the afternoon off. Tuesday rolls around. Stephen King gets up, sits down, and writes 1,000 words. The amateur writer gets up, looks at what he's done, tinkers a little bit, adds another 100, congratulates himself, goes off to lunch again. And by the end of this week, Stephen King is up 20,000 words. And the amateur writer is up 1,500 and still thinking he's doing quite well. And that, Stephen King says, is the difference between a great writer and an unsuccessful one. Writers write. Stephen King himself says he describes himself as a pretty slow reader. He says, I only read 3 novels a week. I don't know about you, but a novel usually takes me about 3 weeks. You know? And I don't have the time. I can't find the time to read it. It's usually 10:30 at night I get into bed and kind of fall asleep looking at the pages. He says 3 novels a week. He's been reading that consistently for the last 40, 50 years. Now think about how many instances of study of his craft that represents 3 times a week. Okay? So 3, 6, 9, 12 times in a month. 100 and something or other, your maths is better than mine, I think it's 125 or so, times a year, unique instances of study of his craft. Stephen King on how talent actually works. So, deliberate practice. This is probably the most important part of this whole talent equation. It allows us to do a number of things. We get to see meaningful chunks. We get to see meaningful chunks. Here's how it works. They took an average Joe off the streets, and they took a master chess player, and they showed them 2 chessboards. Then they walked them away from the chessboards, and they asked them to remember as many pieces as they could and where the pieces were. The average Joe from the street generally manages to remember about 8 pieces, and that's all. That's your average human being. The master chess player knew where every single piece was. So, the conclusion then, does the master chess player have a bigger memory? The answer is no, because here's what they did next. They took the chess pieces and they moved them into ways that don't make sense. Think of this in soccer terms. It's like taking the goalie and putting him in midfield, taking the striker and putting him out on the left wing. And what they did was they rearranged this whole chessboard in a way that a chess game can never go. Then they put the average Joe in front of it, and they put the Grand Master in front of it. And both could remember 8 pieces. So what's the difference? What's actually happening there if it's not memory? The answer is, the master chess player sees a language. He's able to read a situation. He's not looking at a chessboard and remembering where each individual piece is. He can see a scenario that makes sense to him. He sees meaningful chunks. Deliberate practice also allows us to read systems. Now this one's important in the business world. But let's start with how it works in sport. The ball that this guy is about to smack over the net is going to arrive on your side in 1.3 seconds. Are your reflexes good enough to swing and hit it? What do you think? If I had a tennis ball that far away, threw it at you, and it was going to leave the racket and hit you in 1.5 seconds, could you react in time? Okay. Chances are no. Interesting thing is, neither can a professional tennis player. Here's what's actually happening. The professional tennis player is not watching the ball come off the racket and seeing where it goes. The professional tennis player is watching this guy. And because he knows what's going on here, he can tell where that ball is going to go. Aha! That's very different. How does it help us in the business world? Imagine 2 ladies walking into a sales pitch at a customer's business. The one runs the company and knows exactly what she's doing. She's our master practitioner. The young apprentice is very new to the game and has maybe read a couple of books on sales, but all of this is pretty new to her. To the new lady, she walks in the door, sees a building, sits down, does a sales pitch, and goes home. And that's all she sees in that situation. But for the older lady, she arrives at the building, and the way the building looks tells her something about the company. The way she's greeted at the front door gives her cues about how this meeting is going to go. She walks into the meeting room and sees how the chairs are laid out, how she's welcomed, and where she's told to sit. And that tells her something about the power relationships in this company. She sits down and listens to the subtle things that her customer says, and her sales pitch goes off in a completely different direction to what she planned, because she saw something different there that the younger person simply didn't see. Deliberate practice allows us to read more out of a scenario.